thank you for joining us for a
Thank you
great
for having me.
talk. I'd like to welcome Brad Wilkins, our distinguished alumni, for his visit to campus, and also we're going to do just an interview to talk a little bit for graduate students about career paths and how you went from your degree here to what you're doing today. So as I listened to your talk, one of the things that really struck me was the creativity you've brought to bring science to a large industry that most of us as outsiders don't really think about as scientific. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you did that, how you went from the academic side into that sort of approach.
That's a good question. I believe that science is a creative endeavor. So I've always approached my science, or the science that I was able to do creatively. The questions that I was asking, the way that I was approaching the procedures and the methodology to answer those questions, I always felt was creative. And so I wouldn't say it was easy, but it might have been easier for me from that standpoint to translate that creativity into industry, because it does take a lot more, I think, creative approach to how you think about applying or integrating science in industry, especially to do the work that you want to do.
Right.
So being creative in the way that you tell stories, being creative in the way that you connect people to your work, and that's all about telling compelling stories.
Yeah.
And so that became more of what I was required to do and what I liked to do and what I tried to learn how to do better on a regular basis, because we all don't do it perfectly right out of the box, right? So you learn and you fail and you apply a different strategy. The thing that's in business that may be very different than academia in that context of storytelling and convincing people that your ideas are good, is that in academia, as you said, there's generally a process. There's templates where you have grants that you fill out, and you generally go about it in a way that's very established. That's not the case in industry. In industry, it all depends on your audience. Am I talking to an executive? Am I talking to a marketing person? Am I talking to somebody else that's in an advanced research and development kind of organization or field? And so you have to be creative in the way that you adapt and tell your story, and you have to connect with why people care more so than the data and convincing them that you're right. Does that make sense?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
in a grant, you prove to people that you have all these data and you can successfully do this research. In industry, it's probably much more about connecting the person to why they should care about it. What is the outcome, and why is that important to the company, to society, and to the people that the company is trying to serve? And so you tell more about that, and let the science kind of come in a little less known, and so that you can apply it to that outcome. So it's much more about
sneaking the science
a little bit, but you connect people to why they should care about that outcome.
Right.
And everybody at Nike, everybody cares about human performance and helping people be better. And so we approach it from that standpoint. This is going to help people be better, and so we should be allowed to do this work.
So you went from here to the Mayo Clinic, both academic settings.
Yeah.
How did you learn those skills in the transition to Nike?
Yeah, trial by error. Trial by fire. It took a while. I spent almost 10 years at Nike, so I didn't have the same approach on year 9 that I had on year 1. I definitely learned how to interact and how to integrate the way I was thinking into the business, and not let the business change the way I was thinking, but integrate the way I was thinking into how business strategy and business operations and innovation strategy and product development and how all that works. And so that's really how I learned how to do it over time. It definitely was not an overnight thing. And it was just being in that environment and being in a sense. So at a place like Mayo, the Mayo Clinic, you came up with an idea and you set up the experiments and you got to kind of do your research. And if I tried that at Nike, saying I want to do this, I would run into brick walls. And so it's like, well, we're not doing that because we're going to do this. And so I had to be more creative around how I approach that. And so just learn that, like, all right, this process is not working. Like, how I did it here is not working there.
Right.
So I have to be creative around how do I get the work done that I think is important, and I think is important for the company. It wasn't, if it's just you and you're the only one that thinks that work is important, it's not going to get done. You have to show, and you have to genuinely care about what the company's value is going to be and what the people that company serves are going to be. And you have to connect your work to that. Otherwise, the company's not going to do it. And so you have to genuinely care about the ultimate outcome.
Yeah, one of the things that, as I was listening to you now and also in your talk, one of the things that really surprised me is being able to maintain passion for work in a setting that's driven not just by an interest in making things better for people, but also in the bottom line.
Yeah.
And how you craft that passion within that setting, I think is really interesting to think about.
One of the things I learned early on in business, and if you read business books and other kinds of things, there's all of these models that talk about how you form and build businesses are very introspective. Mm-hmm. It's weird to think about it that way, but they ask these books and these models ask, like, what do you care about? What are your passions? And build business around that. And so that's kind of the approach that I took is build the value of my work around that passion for that work, and making sure that it connects with the values of the organization, and it connects with the values of the people that those organizations serve. At the end of the day, that's going to affect the bottom line. Sure. So the bottom line was yes, business, the bottom line matters, market share matters, market price matters. Sure. But I tried to approach it much more of that will figure itself out if we are approaching this work authentically with the passion that I know that the team and myself can do.
Right. So your advice for someone just starting out now, because the world in many ways is a little different in terms of its reaction to science. Yeah. You may have this experience with your consulting company too, but do you have advice on how to take the value of science, your passion for science, and communicate it to audiences that may not think it matters?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I have an answer.
Not to go down the political trail too far, but it does strike me that there's a zeitgeist that when, because I'm a scientist as well, and when I was doing what I did, people cared, and communicating that message, science was valued. Yeah. And I think in some ways the zeitgeist now is to not necessarily value it in the same way.
No, that was actually a very big eye-opening thing for me, coming from an academic environment like the University of Oregon and like the Mayo Clinic, of the kind of ivory tower syndrome, to lack of a better degree. It's not a syndrome, but the how many people care about science and the integrity of that science drops precipitously when you leave the walls of academia. And so that was a big eye-opening thing for me. Like, I would show people and talk about data that I was super excited about, and they're like, well, just, I don't care, or why does that matter? And so going back to why does that matter, and starting with that, and convince, and you're gonna fail at convincing people, especially if they don't care if it matters, or they don't care why it matters, or they don't see the long-term impact of what it is that can influence, or that science can influence. You have to just keep going at it. You fail and you return, and you keep going at it, and you keep trying different approaches. If this story didn't work, try this story. If that story didn't work, then try to figure out another way that you can communicate that effectively. And not just starting with, here are the hard facts, starting with why this matters, and the purpose for how that's going to impact the world, and then filling in with the facts.
I really enjoyed the way, and it reminds me of the way you structured your talk, where you talked about the marathon runners, but you told their stories, and in some ways had us know who they were, at least have a glimpse before we got to data. Yeah. And I assume that was purposeful in kind of the way you approach those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what Yeah, and that's why I start with understanding purpose.
Yeah.
And in the Breaking 2 project, we started with that purpose, and that purpose was to explore the limits of human potential. It wasn't to run a fast marathon. It wasn't to make
Right.
this guy faster or that guy
Sure.
faster. It was, here we are trying to push the limits of what humans are capable of doing. Then you fill in with here, and then it's easy to fill in with these athletes who care about the same thing.
Yeah.
And then you can get to, and here's why we think they should be able to do it based on factual scientific data. And here's how we went about solving these problems.
Yeah.
But we wouldn't have been able to do that project if we started with, here's the facts.
Right.
We started with, we want to explore the limits of human potential. And this is how we could do it with these athletes and with these stories. And I was lucky enough to be in an organization at the time that's really good at storytelling and really good at connecting those things. And we are working with documentarians that are extremely good at telling these athletes' stories. And so bringing all those pieces together, telling the story of the facts, the science story, bringing that with the athlete's story, and bringing that with this why we're doing it in the first place of enhancing or exploring the limits of human potential.
Right.
Those things connected is why I think people connected to it so well.
Yeah. So what about that question is so intriguing to you? Because you talked about it as the theme of your career thus far. What drove you to that one?
From the very beginning?
Well, just in general. I mean,
Yeah.
it has an intriguing quality to it, but sort of an idealistic quality to it.
It is an idealistic quality. So I was into sports when I was younger, and when I started to be intrigued and interested and passionate about science and being able to connect those two things, that's really, for me as an athlete, it was how do I understand my limits? How do I understand what I'm capable of doing? So it became a very me thing and turned into a very, all right, what about society? What about humans as a collective? What are we capable of doing? And applying physiology and translating science into understanding what our capabilities are. It's, why would we go to the moon, or why would we climb Everest, or why would we do some of these amazing things? And I think human nature is to see what our next thing is, or what we're capable of as a society. And so I think it's a lot of human nature too, but my role in that is understanding physiologically and what are our capabilities.
Yeah.
So that's a long story to answer your question, but it connects.
No, it's great.
It connects from how I really started thinking about it more personally, and taking it to really, all right, what are we as a species capable of doing?
Yeah. So what's next? Do you have a thought about what the next limit question is?
As far as human performance capabilities, I think this idea of I like the idea of how humans working together can be much less limited than they are alone. So how do teams interact? How both from a physiological standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, from a sociological standpoint, and trying to think about how teams interact, because a team can do much more than a person can alone. So what are can we push the limits of human potential in environments where teams are doing it? And how do you optimize and accentuate each other's limits and or capabilities in that environment to extend what one person can do alone?
It's really interesting. I mean, the example you gave of the Tour de France is really interesting. When you've watched, there's clearly someone who's supposed to win on that team when I watched it, but the team comes together to make that happen.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
And sometimes in those races, that person who's supposed to win changes.
Yeah.
And so
exactly.
as the team is doing something, there's for the most part they're doing it for one person, but it's dynamic in a lot of ways.
And that's what in many ways makes it exciting,
Yeah.
I'm sure, to study as a question. So kind of related to that, the leap from Nike to your own business.
Yeah.
How was that in terms of your career path?
Yeah.
Why, or was there a particular thought in terms of that trajectory of what you're interested in identifying?
Yes and no. So there's, So I think I reached a point in my career at Nike where I had done some amazing things, and I was successful at doing those amazing things, and it was a point of just kind of like, what's next?
Right.
You know, and I could have done a lot of that what's next potentially at Nike, but I also felt like, all right, if not now, when? If I didn't go and do and try to kind of extend my own boundaries outside of some potential constraints that I could see at Nike, if I didn't try to extend my own boundaries in a certain way, when, you know, my chances of doing it later were a lot less. And so it was a lot of, if not now, it's probably not going to happen. So let's just go for it and see, and again, take advantage of opportunities that may not be obvious, and go after it, and try to push my own boundaries and my own limits. I mean, I talk about my purpose as pushing boundaries and human limits. Like, so I got to do that for myself just as much as I do that for others. So.
Right. I did it when I was looking at the materials before your visit. I had that very same thought that this is just the embodiment of what it is you're interested in as a scientist, that you're actually a test case now in some ways. Like, what else can we do? So thinking a little bit about your time here, were there skills that you wish you'd learned while you were here?
It's a good question. It's always hard. We are an embodiment and a product of every experience that we've had. So it's hard to say how different skills would have contributed to where I am today. But I was just talking with some of the grad students about this. I do think that if as a grad student I knew that I was going to go into industry, or I had that interest, I would have gotten more business model, business theory classes, marketing, business strategy, innovation strategy, those kinds of things. I learned that along the way, and it helped me a lot. But coming in with at least the models and the theory I think would have been beneficial. But I didn't know that I was taking an industry career path. So, and then communication, being able to write and communicate and tell stories effectively, not untruthful stories, not fiction, but you're telling effective stories. That would be another thing that I wish I would have worked on a little bit more when I was here, and have a little bit more experience with that. So those two things. I think the storytelling part is going to benefit anybody if they go into academic science, or if they go into science and industry. And I do think that having a little bit of understanding of how business works would affect anybody that's going into academic science versus, I mean, especially as you get in administrative positions and those kinds of things, you have to understand how the business works, how the strategies are, and how models might impact decision making. And so I think even when you're running your own lab in academia, like, you have grad students and you have postdocs and you have teams, and understanding leadership and understanding how you should think about these things, and the models that underpin that, can help everybody. So I do think both of those things could benefit both academic and industry science.
You're a fantastic spokesperson for the idea of core skills, regardless of the career path that you go on. So it's really important. So do you get back to Eugene very often? I know you work at Portland frequently, or you teach at Portland. So.
No, I do get back here frequently. Still collaborate with John Halliwell and Chris Vinson quite a bit. They're involved in John Halliwell especially is involved in the sport product management program that I teach at, and so we interact quite a bit. So I get down here a few times a year to do some things down here with them. Yeah.
So have you seen, since you are still connected with the department, have you seen an evolution in the way things are done, or does it feel like it was kind of like when you were here?
I guess I'm not as integrated in the department as I was when I was here, obviously. It was a lot smaller when I was here. The Department of Human Physiology has grown precipitously. It's grown a lot since I was here. I was one of just a few grad students. Really? I think when I first started, I was the only physiology grad student when I first came here. The department was coming out of a bad time in its history, and so I there was other biomechanics grad students and neuroscience grad students, but I was the only physiology grad student. And then a couple more trickled in, and so from that standpoint, to see all of these grad students coming in, and to see, like today they're having,
Right.
potential grad students come in, like
Sure.
that never happened. Like to have a day where potential grad students would come in and both the school would convince them that they should come here, as well as them, convincing the school that they're high quality. Like that never happened. And so from that standpoint, it's awesome to see. It's cool to be able to see that the department has grown and has extended. Like you see a lot of the graduates that came after me that have very good academic careers and even some industry careers that are doing very well. And so that's probably the biggest evolution, is just the size and the interaction that they have.
Yeah. You mentioned both now and in your talk about the impact that a couple of faculty members had on your work and on your career path, and in some ways still being involved in collaborating. Obviously there's an impact, but when you reflect on that, what was that impact? How did that work?
So, yeah, as I mentioned before, I feel like I'm a very creative problem solver. We were always, one of the biggest things I think from that perspective is how they impacted my work is they enabled us to be that way. So when we were grad students, there wasn't like, you're doing this project and here's how you're going to do it. It was very much like, here's the purview of our lab, here's the general construct of the things that we study. Let's talk about how we're going to approach these big questions and how would you want to approach it. And so that creativity and that discovery was enabled and promoted. And so that's probably the biggest, thinking back, that's probably one of the biggest things that they did for me, was being able, just allowing me to do those things.
Right. What a really nice way to educate, too.
Yeah.
I mean, to sort of take people with skills and then provide a framework, but then allow them creativity to explore that. Yeah. It's really a nice model in many ways.
Yeah, no, they were very good at doing that. And I think there was a time, part of it was the timing. I was one of the only grad students, and they were new, fresh, out of their postdocs, just starting. And so like we were literally building a lab, that is now a very prolific lab that I started and did my PhD in. And so we were literally plugging things in and learning how to use all this stuff together. And so that exploratory side of that stuff is partially because of the timing, but also because these faculty were enabling us and promoting that way of thinking.
Yeah, I often think about kind of the fit of students and faculty and people in their careers. The fit is so critical, and it feels like that fit, whether you've made it this way or made the choices or whatever, but the fit of always being in a vibrant environment where you can be creative. Yeah. Obviously you bring that to it too, but an environment that allows that to exist is kind of neat. And do you have advice for, it's probably a really impossible question, but do you have advice
as opposed to the other ones that you
No, they've all been so easy. For students, how do you find that?
You're right, that is an impossible question.
Yes, if we can answer that one.
I truly believe you create it. And the frustration that you have in creating that is going to dictate how easy, or is dictated by how easy those environments are in promoting that. Meaning that if those environments are stagnant and they are super restrictive and they are antagonistic to creativity, your frustration in creating your own creativity is going to be very, very high. Of course. Versus the other one, I could have waited around and had people tell me what to do, but I decided to approach it in a way that was creative and that was promoted and allowed, and so that it was the environment along with my desire to create that sort of environment and the way that I think about things that brought it together. So. I think if somebody's trying to create an environment that is highly creative, if somebody's trying to create a career path that is highly creative in an environment that restricts that, they could probably still do it. They'll just be really mad. Right. They'll just be really frustrated and probably not, and take the first train out as soon as they can, right? And so, but they still can be successful in thriving in that environment.
Yeah, it strikes me that one of the things that's really interesting about your story is the leaps of faith you were willing to take, though. And I think finding the courage for people new in a business or new with a degree to take those kind of leaps of faith. And how does that, is that just personal? Is that something that can be taught?
I don't know if I would consider it a leap of faith, because I'm generally conservative in my way of doing things. I just always did what I wanted to do next.
Yeah.
And so it was like, oh, like this opportunity, like that's cool.
Yeah.
Like I can see how I can bring some value, and I can understand how I can play a role in that environment. So I went and did it. I just kind of like, this is the next thing that I want to do, and I went and did it. And so you look back and you see that okay, now there's a path there,
yeah.
but that path was only driven from like what was happening next. It wasn't driven from any preconceived plan. And of course, life dictates some of that too. Life decisions, where you want to live, how you want to live, who you're going to marry, all these other kinds of things, and what they want to do. When it becomes no longer just about you, then those things dictate some of those decisions as well. But you find like, okay, here's the next thing I want to do. I think I can do that here, and that fits that lifestyle decisions that you and your partner and your family make. Then it's the same thing. This is what I think I can do, and the work that I think I can accomplish there.
One of the most compelling things from your talk that I hope students really think about is the idea of not letting your job interfere with your work. And that's in many ways what it sounds like you just described, the next thing, the next thing.
Yeah. So, and that was kind of the whole point of the talk, was that a job position doesn't necessarily dictate the work that you can do in that position. And so that, but yeah, it's thinking about the work and how that adds value to your job, more so than thinking about what the job is going to dictate you to do for your work. That's generally how I tried to approach things.
What a great message. It really is a great message.
Thank you.
And perhaps we'll end on that so you
Okay.
can go have lunch
fine.
and continue to let people know
Okay.
these kind of things. But I really appreciate you taking time
Thank you.
to
I'm glad you got a
the-
chance to see the talk as well.
Oh, I was delighted. I'm
Great.
really glad I was
Great.
there. So I learned a lot. It was terrific.
Thank you. Great.
So,
Thank you
so
very
it was
much.
wonderful to meet you.
Wonderful to meet
we're
you.
delighted you're back here. I hope we get to see you again
Yeah.
on your next visit.
Yeah, I'm in and out.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.